All right, here we go. Ramble Part 2. This is the follow-up to my first Ramble video, which I put out 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point. That video I was just talking a little bit about my background as a player, what I had been working on, what my near-term, long-term goals were potentially. At the end of that video, I had mentioned that I wanted to do a second part of the video and talk a little bit more in depth about the Ironman meta, my thoughts on the state of the skilling meta, how it's changed over the years, where I see it going in the future, things I like about it, things I don't like about it. Um, so that is this video now. I guess I want to thank you guys. I got a fantastic response on the first video I made. A lot of very good feedback. I wasn't sure how popular it was going to be. I wasn't sure if people were going to like it or not, but yeah, it was very positive, so I was encouraged to make part 2 here, even though it was a little bit more delayed than I'd would have liked it to be. I was hoping to do it a little closer to the first one. I guess just a quick update on what I have done since then. I remember in that video I was cutting teak trees, working on banking, construction. So since then I've wrapped up 50 mil wood cutting. I was pretty close at the time, and I also finished 50 million construction. Knocked out about 33 mil in about a week. Did not enjoy construction at all. The myth hangers are an absolute pain in the ass. That I struggled a bit with that skill. Was only maintaining probably like 350k or so while doing it, which was definitely disappointed in. Moved on to mining now. I did all of my humidify for the jugs I'll need for. I have about 70 mil cooking or so banked, so I'll be doing that in my downtime with mining, but my primary focus the next couple weeks is going to be to wrap up 50 mil mining. I'm about 27 mil right now, so going to try to do granite while I record this video. If I end up being too distracted, I have my little notepad up with the notes I wanted to talk about, so if I feel like I'm getting too distracted, if my granite rates are absolute shit, I might head to Arty, but I'd prefer to stick with the mining. I figure it would be, if anybody is watching this video for some reason as opposed to just listening to it, I figured granite would be a little bit more interesting of a visual. So I guess let's jump into it. So, state of the Ironman skilling meta. I guess the first thing I'll talk about is what I have seen change about it. Like I've said, I've been only really focused on skilling in particular for about 18 months now, but even before that, when I was working on maxing my Ironman, I was well aware of what the efficient metas were at the time, even though I didn't have any long-term skilling goals myself. So in a general sense, I've been pleased to see that, at least in a theoretical sense, 200 mil all skills on an Ironman has become, I would say, a realistic goal for some players. Obviously, it would be a massive undertaking. I'm not trying to undercut that. It's a significant portion of your youth that you'd be sinking into the game going for that. But it is viable now. When Ironman mode first came out and people were killing Zulrah for their essence for rune crafting and doing herb or whatever the EHP rate was at the time, like 25 or 30k or something. At that point in the game mode, 200 mil all was not viable. You would have been killing. I mean, it was close to 10,000 Zulrah just to max initially prior to Zaya. So, I mean, if you think about the amount of Zulrah you would have to kill to go for 200 mil RC, you'd be spending years at Zulrah alone. So, at least in my opinion, I'd say that it was not viable at that point. I don't know exactly at what point 200 mil became viable. Sometime in the last several years. I mean, couple obviously big updates that pushed it along. Looking at my notes, Herbor obviously between contracts, birdhouses has become 2 or 3 times faster than it was initially. Prayer with the wilderness altar got significantly faster. That was extremely slow at first, especially prior to the achievement diaries. I'm not sure how long Ironman mode was out before achievement diaries, but without the noted bones in the wilderness, between that and no wilderness altar, prayer would have been an abysmally slow skill. Obviously, Zaya RC making RC a viable skill, even though it still takes 5,000 hours with souls or whatever it is. We can talk a little bit later on in the video about the Day Old Essence. Definitely the new meta quite a bit higher effort than Souls. You need to 1.5 tick the essence for it to be better, but it's still quite fast, and I've done it max effort. I believe the RC XP an hour works out to somewhere around 65k, which not much slower at all than like the main solo lavas rate. So RC definitely become viable over time. Even though you had your Zulrah nerf, which at the time was a massive blow to the Ironman skilling meta, but we've had the Vorkath obviously come into the game since then, which isn't a direct replacement in a lot of senses, because a lot of the skills that Zulrah provided for Vorkath isn't necessarily the same. Obviously, they both do cooking. Vorkath way more prayer, but a lot less seeds. On the whole, though, Vorkath is stronger than Zulrah ever was. So we've definitely had quite a few large updates like that have come into the game that have made 200 mil all viable. I really don't know how many players will achieve it. Obviously, it's going to depend partially on the longevity of the game. No one's even close. I believe Dids is, at the current rates, about halfway done. I don't know exactly. Higer a little bit behind him. Obviously, if history holds true for Ironman mode, things will continue to speed up at a pretty quick pace. So I think it's pretty fair to say that they're both over halfway point in terms of when they would actually achieve it, assuming they hold their current paces. Obviously, I don't know them that well personally. I can't say if they're actually going to do it, but I'd say there are players like that who could quite realistically achieve 200 mil all in Ironman mode, which years ago would not have been even something that people would be considering. So I guess that's kind of like a very high level overview. I guess I'll jump into a little bit more things I like about Ironman mode, things I don't like about it. In particular, one of my biggest gripes with the game mode, and I know this is things that mains have complained about Ironman mode before as well, is that there are so many skills, especially slow skills, that just have such low effort methods, like that you're going to spend a huge chunk of time doing a low engagement method. I think the biggest offenders before were crafting, obviously blowing glass at like 2 APM, and then Zaya RC Souls, like 5,000 hours of that. Dale Essence, in a way, has replaced that. I imagine most players are still going to opt for Souls, as they're about somewhere between 0.8 and 0.9 compared to Dale. Obviously, that's an effective RC rate at Souls, because it's being scaled up for the crafting and the mining, so you're not, in terms of like strictly RC, Dale is considerably faster. So I do expect, though, just given how easy Souls are to do, how low effort, I imagine a lot of players will stick with that. So I'm glad to see that's changed somewhat, and I'm planning on doing mostly Dale myself. But I think the amount of low effort skills, and the fact that obviously for Ironman, I know it's controversial, and I'm not planning on talking about it at length here, but like there are certain skills, like Splayer in particular, where you can use alts to speed up certain tasks, make certain tasks viable. Wow, my mining is absolute shit in this video, by the way. I'm definitely disappointed in myself. But like with Slayer, you can use alts, speed things up, and there are a handful of other skills like Hunter and similar where you can use an alt to speed up a method slightly. But during your slow skills, like I was talking about, like the crafting and the RC, the fact that there's no pressure or no need to be playing like money making alts on the side. I know it's one thing that if you're a main and you play money making alts, it probably sounds really nice just to be able to like sit back and watch TV and not worry about making money. But personally, I've really struggled with low engagement skills like that. I get really bored. I find it hard to maintain good hours, maintain good rates while doing it. While I'm like really easily distracted. I always find myself like reading Twitter, going on Discord, fucking around, doing whatever. So I'm in general, I think it's moving in a positive direction where more and more skills are adopting more high effort methods. But I still think that compared to the main game mode, it is somewhat lacking in that respect. Another thing I really need to talk about is I guess, hourlies. It wouldn't be a discussion of the Ironman meta without talking about it. And I want to try to address the issue in a more nuanced way than just saying, wow, hourly's bad, hourlies suck. I mean, I'm definitely no fan of them myself. I think an over-reliance on hourlies for many different skills is bad game design. But I also understand that, in a way, it's a more fair way to speed up certain skills. Like speeding up a skill like Herbor by making seeds more readily available so hourlies are easier to maintain. I'd much rather they move in that direction for speeding up skills as opposed to releasing like a standalone active method where you can train 80k Herbor an hour. So I don't think they're necessarily always bad for game design, if that makes sense. I think there's definitely trade-offs. I think the thing I struggle with hourlies the most isn't necessarily like a lack of motivation, even though I've definitely taken periods off of doing hourlies. At least personally, I really struggle to maintain good rates for whatever else I'm doing the day while trying to do hourlies. One of the reasons, you can see like right here, I have all my herb run gear on me. The more times I interact with the bank, the worse my rates overall for the day are. I find it so much easier to get distracted, get sidetracked, end up just bank standing or whatever, every time I have to go to the bank. So like when I was doing this before and I was going to the bank, every time I needed to gear up to do an herb run or a bird run, tree run, whatever, my overall just like my XP per hour for the day was just tanking for whatever skill I was actively training. I don't think I realized quite how bad I was about this until I was competing in fantasy, and when I was actually just sitting and doing like whatever skill I wanted to train 18 hours a day, and I saw the kind of gains I could make when I wasn't jumping around doing all kinds of different things throughout the day. It really kind of just put in perspective for me how much time I was wasting, because like I'll have days now where I'll play as many hours as I was playing during fantasy, and if I'm doing hourlies, I struggle to hit the rates I was getting for those skills, even when you factor out the time for the hourlies themselves. So like you say, like herb run, whatever, I don't know exactly, like 3 or 4 minutes, something like that, to do a full herb run. My overall XP per hour suffers way more than just what that 3 or 4 minutes should take out of it, if that makes sense. So that's something I've struggled with, trying to find a balance between whatever skill I'm focusing on and doing hourlies. I've not necessarily figured out what's best for me yet. I've been going back and forth between like trying to do a balance where I do like say like 6 herb runs a day. So like I don't do them constantly on cooldown, but I try to do like a set number a day. And then I've also gone through periods where I'm saying like, well, some days I'll do, or like with some methods I'll do herb runs on cooldown. So like whenever it's up, where the Amuleta Nature like I'm doing right now, and do an herb run whenever it goes off. And then I'll say as a trade-off, I'll take weeks, like a week here and there, and do no hourlies at all. So I'm still going back and forth. I'm trying to figure out exactly what works best for me. But I do think that if you're the type of player who enjoys like really getting into the flow of particularly like a high effort skill, like if you're doing like mining or fishing or something like that, and you're really like you're honed in, you're focused, you're enjoying it, having that flow constantly interrupted by hourlies, not only does it make the method less enjoyable to me, but it also it makes the skill drag so much more. So I think there is a skill that goes into being able to manage the hourlies with your other skills. I'm very impressed by people like Dids who are able to keep up on the hourlies. Like the amount of contracts he does is ridiculous, while obviously still getting good gains outside of Herbor. So that's one thing I'm always trying to push myself to improve on, and one thing that I think is going to be difficult to balance for newer Ironman skillers. Let me take a look at my notes, see what else I want to talk about. Yeah, this is a big one too, and one that I've been thinking about more and more recently, and it's the way Ironman mode, I don't want to say forces, even though that's what I initially wrote down. I'd say forces or rewards or encourages skill hopping. In particular, not finishing 200 mil in skills. I think one of the big risks in Ironman mode, even more so than for mains, I mean, this is obviously a fair concern for mains too, but I think historically it's been shown to be much bigger issues for irons, and that's having large portions of a skill suddenly become tied into another skill. So like the two biggest examples I think that illustrate this are with Hunter having like 80 or 90 mil of your Hunter XP efficiently come through birdhouses now. And another example would be with mining, when you suddenly have to mine sandstone for efficient crafting. I don't know the exact amount of mining XP needed for 200 mil crafting. It's probably somewhere around maybe 20, 25 mil mining, which I mean isn't a massive amount as a proportion, but I mean you're still talking like you could, if you had knocked out 200 mil mining early on an Ironman, I mean you'd be losing 250, 300 hours, something like that to that update. So I think I've always enjoyed skill hopping myself, so it's not necessarily a gripe of mine, but I know there's a large portion of the skilling community that thinks that like not only do they think that like doing skill straight is more enjoyable, but they also think it's like the sign of a better skiller. And in a sense I agree. I think there's something very true about like being able to sit down and knock out a skill over a couple of months depending on how fast it is. Like do it straight, get on every day, log in, do the method until you log off. Like that does require a lot of mental fortitude to do. Whereas if you look across like the Ironman skilling community, for the most part, people aren't really knocking out 200 mils outside of like fire making and thieving. And I think those are pretty safe from devaluation, in my opinion. Obviously, the agility changes with sepulcher making swimming a lot worse would speak to the contrary about thieving. But I'd say on the whole, if you knocked out 200 mil thieving on an Ironman doing really any method, you're not setting yourself much behind, even if portions of it are now efficiently gained through other methods, like potentially the glass blowing with Piscatorius thieving that I know some people are playing around with right now. So I think personally, I'm not sure how much I'm going to let this impact my planning going forward. Obviously right now I'm working on the 50 mil base goal, which I think is just a good starting point and something I don't know, to me seems like a very good achievement to work towards, especially in Ironman mode. After that, I'm not sure. I was tentatively planning to try to work on 200 mils and a couple of skills that I really enjoy. But I do think that in Ironman mode, this is not the way to go about it. I think leaving yourself portions of skills to be gotten, I don't want to say necessarily passively, but just that it could become tied into another skill in a future update is a smart way to do it. Another good example, I didn't write this one down ahead of time, but I was just thinking about it now, is like the amount of crafting XP you get passively now. So like you think about like all the sources you have like for gems, for dragon hides, especially like from Vorkath. Like there isn't, like you wouldn't call those like 0-time crafting methods, but like at the same time, if I went in the next 6 months and knocked out 200 mil crafting, I definitely would not be efficiently progressing my account because I'm just effectively gaining nothing from all the future dehyde drops and gems I'm going to get from various sources. So I do think that Ironman mode rewards skill hopping in that way and balancing your skills, which some people will enjoy, some people won't, but I think that's just the nature of the game mode. So it's something I felt that was worth talking about here. For me, I would say it's something I'm not a fan of. I know for a lot of people they like this about Ironman mode, and that's how over-centralizing of a skill Slayer is. Slayer in particular, at like the start of Ironman mode, you weren't getting a significant amount of resources, and you weren't Slayer wasn't tied to other skills. It was another skill where the goal was just, let's gain this XP as fast as possible. Obviously, like you got some alchables from various tabs, but it wasn't a huge amount. Whereas now, especially with Vorkath, the amount of skills that Slayer is directly or indirectly tied into is huge. Like obviously outside of your combats, a huge portion of your prayer from Vorkath and other dragon tasks, a good bit of your crafting from Vorkath, and a huge amount of your cooking will come from Vorkath. Additionally, Vorkath will provide all of your, not all, but majority, probably somewhere around 75%, depending on how you play the game, of your GP for your buyable skills. I think it would be a fair point to say, well, that's not necessarily Slayer being over-centralized. It's Vorkath being overpowered as a boss. And I guess where you draw the line between Slayer and Vorkath Slayer as being different pieces of content, I mean, that's up to you. It's subjective. But to me, at least, Slayer has become such a huge portion of the Ironman meta and is so prone to updates influencing the rest of the game. I want to say concerning, really. I don't mind training Slayer. I enjoy the skill. I think there's a lot of interesting aspects to it, but Slayer requires so much planning, so much thought going into it, what you're going to get out of every task you do, that even potentially small Slayer updates can have a large impact on like the overall course of your account. So actually leads into one of the things somebody asked when I made my previous video. Something they wanted me to talk about in this was, how do I feel about Ironman mode having certain bosses that account for a huge portion of skilling? So, like, obviously prior it was Zulrah, and then after the nerf and the introduction of Vorkath, it's now Vorkath, where, like, not only do you spend, I'm trying to think, I mean, if the efficient numbers for how much Vorkath you kill, I've heard varying reports, but I mean, you're going to spend over 1,000 hours killing Vorkath, most likely, if your goal was 200 mil. Huge portion of time. And you're going to get a huge amount of your prayer, almost all of your GP, almost all of your cooking from it. So, I'm trying to think of exactly how I want to phrase it. I didn't write anything down. On one hand, I think this has always been a pretty core aspect of Ironman mode, and one that I don't want to change. I like how Ironman mode has roots in PVM. I'm not a big PVMer myself. I actually do enjoy quite a few PVM methods. I've never been one for setting RNG goals for myself. But on the whole, I do like that Ironman mode rewards being good at PVM, even as a skiller. Being able to get, like, obviously, get Infernal Cape, being able to get the best kills per hour at things like Zulrah, Hydra, Vorkath, you're gonna gain advantages over other skillers. I do like that. I think that that's healthy for the game. What I don't like about how over-centralized these skills have become is how potentially small changes to these bosses can have massive effects on not only like individual account progression, but like just from a competitive aspect. Like a player who's already done a lot of Slayer and Vorkath, if Vorkath was potentially like nerfed or changed in some way, could like almost overnight gain 1,000, 2,000 hours on their competition, which, I mean, the alternative is that would be having enough other GP sources to cover Vorkath. Like I know that the JMods talked about on that Q&A they did, I don't know how long ago it was now, maybe 6 months ago, they were talking about how several of them were working on a rebalanced Vorkath drop table. That was it. At the time, I'm obviously the Reddit community goes through phases where they care about certain things more than others. That was one of the times they were complaining a lot about GP, the amount of like raw GP coming from bosses. So they were asking about that, and the JMods mentioned they were working on a new Vorkath table. I think there was panic at the time. That's somewhat gone away now, but I think the point remains that, like, should they change that Vorkath drop table, say they removed like the Rune and Dragon Alkables, or they removed the Grapes or something like that, like overnight you're going to have huge ramifications on competitive skilling for Ironman. And I think, I mean, obviously Vorkath drop table is relevant to the game and an important game balance aspect outside of Ironman mode. Like so many players farm that boss. I assume a lot of gold farmers as well. I know there's Vorkath bots. So like Jagex feeling the need to balance that. I mean, they can't just take into account how it's going to impact competitive Ironman skilling. I mean, we're such a niche community that has to be an afterthought to other potential impacts it's having on the game economy. So I'm not going to say, well, the stupid JMods changing my GP boss, now I have to remap my 200 mil all route. I mean, I wouldn't blame them if they made that change, but at the same time, I think that there's just so much instability in not just Vorkath, but almost the whole Slayer meta, where, like, if Vorkath was changed, like obviously not only would you have to find GP sources in other places, but a lot of the ways people do Slayer right now, like with the heavy barrage task focus list, if GP suddenly becomes tighter, you're going to need to rethink doing like barrage abbeys, barrage stars, barrage velds, things like that. Like you're not going to have that extra GP now. Like not only are you going to have to consider sources outside of Slayer, but you're not going to have the freedom to slay in such a, I want to say like excessive manner. I think Slayer as a whole is a topic that almost deserves its own video to discuss some of the nuances to it and potential future changes. I was actually talking with a friend about potentially doing some kind of duo ramble in the future. I know Slayer is a topic that he and I both have some strong opinions on, so might be doing that. I won't go on too much further in this video now. So, let me look. What else was on my list of questions to talk about? Somebody asked, what do I think makes a good player, micro versus macro? I know this is a topic that's been discussed a lot in the skilling community over the years. I've heard it talked about on prior podcasts I've listened to. So I guess I can answer it not only in my own personal perspective, but I think what it means, micro versus macro, for Ironman mode versus just the main game for main skillers. I will say, on the whole, I think macro is more important in the Ironman game mode. I think the aspect of planning, mapping out your GP sources, your Herbor sources, taking into account all the various passive sources of things like crafting, cooking, construction, things like that. That's highly important to the game mode. It's almost essential if you want to be a long-term competitive player. And not that skill isn't important for mains, but you can be a good main skiller if you're able to make the money and just sit down and bang out 200 mil after 200 mil, good micro, play good hours. Whereas if you do that in Ironman mode and you're not on top of all of your routing, I think you can potentially be punished much more. Especially for things like Herbor, where you have such a huge portion of it is coming from like non-active training sources. So things like your contracts and your Slayer monsters. Like if you were, say, like 60-70% of the way done with Ironman mode and you were lacking on Herbor, your options to suddenly like start banking more Herbor or like to pick up on that are you're in trouble. You don't have a lot of good sources to be like, oh shit, I'm short on Herbor XP. What am I going to do to get more? Like you can start doing more contracts then, but you're going to be behind. So in that sense, I do think macro is more important for Ironman. To talk about the micro aspect, at least in my opinion, micro is certainly important to be a good player. You have to have the micro for me to consider you a good player. But I think where that line for micro is drawn for me is at the ability to do any method, regardless of the micro required. So like good players will do granite, they'll do cut eat barb, they'll do whatever 1.5 tick Daled Essence. Being able to do those methods and do them for a long period of time, that level of micro does make a good player. I believe that strongly. But at the same time, once you reach that threshold of being able to do any method and do it consistently, like differences in XP rate, like somebody who gets 115, 120k doing granite versus somebody who does like 130k long term. Like, wow, I'd be like, damn, that's impressive that you're pulling 130k long term. But I don't really consider people like that to be better players. I mean, being able to have the focus and the mechanical skill to maintain those rates, that's impressive on its own. But that's not the bar I draw for being a good player in this game. That's not something I value that highly. I do think that the micro aspect, at least for me, is more about like a motivation and just an enjoyable way to play the game. Like constantly focus on improving your own ability to maintain rates, get better rates, things like that. It makes the game more interesting. Like I like focusing on what I'm doing, trying to improve in small ways. Like I could just do granite with Netflix on, half pay attention, pull 115k, and like realistically, I'm not going to save that much time long term. But focusing on the micro is in my opinion, just a more enjoyable way to play the game. Obviously, there's going to be lower effort skills, there's going to be lower effort methods that you sometimes do. You can't be fully focused all the time, but I'm not a big, like, you have to be able to pull XYZ rates with whatever skills to be a good player. I don't value things like that highly. I just think it's a more interesting, more enjoyable way to play. So that was really all I had on my list to talk about this video. It was probably a little more, jumped around a little bit more than I did in my prior video. In my prior video, I didn't really have much written down. I was just kind of going through like an oral history, a little bit of a discussion about my goals. So it was a little more free-flowing, whereas this one was a little bit more scripted, a little bit more of me reading off the list. But that's just because there were quite a few points I wanted to hit, and at least for me, I'm not able just to throw the recorder on and talk about something as broad as like game balance and the meta and hit all the points I want to make. So if it sounded a little bit jumpy, I apologize, but hopefully it was still enjoyable. I've been really enjoying listening to the rambles recently, making my own, so I'd really like to keep making these for the channel. Obviously, I don't want to do them too often. I want to make sure that I have things that I'm actually interested to talk about, because nobody wants to hear me just turn the recorder on and talk about nothing for 20 minutes with no real focus. So as long as I have things to talk about, though, I'd really like to keep making these in the future. I've also potentially talked to a couple people about getting together and maybe doing like some duo rambles, talking about some more Ironman related topics in more depth, get some people who also have some very good insight to the game mode, so potentially look out for that as well. And as always, guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully there'll be another one of these in the near future. All right.